Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to go over the most recent homework. This was homework number 9, looking at monopolistic competition. Remember, monopolistic competition is between monopoly and perfect competition, and actually that's kind of what the first question asks, right? The first question asks you to really dissect what monopolistic competition is, how it works, how it is the same and different from monopoly and from perfect competition. And so basically monopolistic competition is like a monopoly in that firms see a downward sloping demand curve and a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. It's like a monopoly and like a perfectly competitive firm in that our company is going to select a profit maximizing quantity based on marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And like a monopoly, they're going to charge a price based on the demand curve, not the marginal revenue curve. And so we can see economic profit in the short run in monopolistic competition, just like we could in a monopoly. We can also see losses, and that's going to just depend on where that average total cost curve is. We see a markup on price above marginal cost, and we're going to see quantities tend to be lower and prices tend to be higher in monopolistic competition, just like a monopoly. How is it like perfectly competitive markets then? Well, the big difference between monopolistic competition and a monopoly, the way that it's more like a perfectly competitive market, is the barriers to entry. Remember, in a monopoly, barriers to entry prevent other firms from coming in, so they never face competition in the long run. That's not true in monopolistic competition. In monopolistic competition, what we see is new firms can enter. And so that demand curve is going to shift down as more and more firms compete, offering similar but not the same products. And that's kind of the big difference between monopolistic competition and the other two, is that monopoly has no substitutes, perfect competition has many substitutes. Monopolistic competition is right in the middle. There are substitutes, but they're different, right? They're not perfect substitutes. So monopolistic competition is like a perfectly competitive market in that there is zero economic profit in the long run. Firms produce at marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, and there are many firms with low barriers to entry. So we see firms enter and exit based on profit and losses in the short run, just like in a perfectly competitive market. So they really do bridge the gap in between those two spaces. Does that kind of make sense? So you have a firm that acts like a monopolist in the short run with a downward sloping demand curve, downward sloping marginal revenue curve, low quantities, and high prices, that markup of pricing on demand curve, not on the marginal revenue, marginal cost curve. But in the long run, the entry and exit and the competition is going to erode demand, make demand for that one firm smaller, meaning that they will eventually get to a zero economic profit point, which is going to lead to excess demand, and still a price markup. And that's kind of how we answer the question to Part B. Part B asks, what prevents firms in a monopolistic competition's market structure from earning long-run economic profits? And that's this idea of entry and exit. Because firms can enter in the long run in a monopolistically competitive market, any market where firms are earning economic profits, we are going to see new firms enter and suck up some of the demand that the existing firms had, shifting that demand for that one firm down, lowering the marginal revenue, lowering the price until we get to a point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, at a point where demand is tangent to the average total cost curve. So price equals average total cost, even though it doesn't equal marginal cost or marginal revenue. Does it kind of make sense? Hopefully. We'll do a couple more graphs and that should help. The next question has a great graph to look at this stuff. The last question in part 1 asks, what are the costs of monopolistic competition and what are the benefits? And this gets back to the idea of why we don't see a lot of regulation around monopolistic competition. We spent a lot of time when we talked about monopoly talking about how to regulate monopolies, that they're bad for the economy, they generate a deadweight loss, prices are high, quantities are low, everyone hates it, it's terrible, we regulate them heavily. We don't see the same thing with a monopolistically competitive market. And part of that's because the inefficiencies are small. There is that excess capacity, right? The idea that we could be minimizing costs if the firm was producing more, but they're producing at a smaller quantity. And we do see that markup of price above marginal cost and marginal revenue. But generally, these tend to be pretty small inefficiencies because of the competition these firms face. And there's a benefit associated with monopolistically competitive firms. Unlike perfect competition, we have variation, we have options, we have choices. And while that might not be so important in some markets where I might not care, trying to think of an example here, what kind of pen I have, right? I think this was the example I've used in class a couple of times. I might not care what kind of pen I have, or I might have small preferences, but the markup's going to be small because I don't care a lot. But there are some things I really care about, and I want my specific version. Like I want my clothing brand, I want my coffee brand, I want my car brand. And when products are differentiated, that means there's a lot of variety for us to choose from. And there's a benefit from getting to pick what matches us perfectly. So some days, I want I might prefer to buy a pair of shoes that are affordable and low cost, or I might prefer something that is fancy and from a specific brand I want. And monopolistic competition allows us to select that because there are so many options. In the textbook, there's the example of the different pizza places, right? There's Pizza Hut, there's DiGiorno, there's Domino's, there's Papa Murphy's, there's all these different places providing pizza. And so they're monopolistically competitive, which means there's inefficiencies. But it also means we get to choose. We get to pick what kind of pizza we prefer. And economists argue that there's a benefit to that that should also be taken into consideration. So that's problem one. Problem number 2 talks about the market for shirts by a single designer, Adam Smith, and basically is describing a monopolistically competitive market. While not the only producer of shirts, fans of Adam Smith shirts are willing to pay for this specific brand. And then I've got a graph provided that is on a graph paper that asks you to determine the profit maximizing quantity and price, the perfectly competitive price and quantity, the excess capacity, and the outcome, and whether this outcome is in the long run or the short run. So I think the best way to solve this problem is I'm going to go ahead and pull the graph up on my screen and show you the outcomes there. So give me just one sec. Okay, so here on the screen you can see the question number 2 and the graph associated with it. And the idea here is that we have an average total cost curve, a marginal cost curve, a downward sloping demand curve, and a marginal revenue curve. So this looks like a monopolist, but because there are other firms producing these shirts, we know that it's monopolistically competitive. Let me make it a little bit bigger. And now we can talk about this. So the first thing we want to do is determine the profit maximizing price and quantity. And that's going to be where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So let's go ahead and insert a dot where that is marginal revenue equals marginal cost right here. And then what I want to do is put a line in that takes me from the quantity that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost all the way up to the demand curve. And that's a little bit, there we go, that's probably more in play there. And I'll go ahead and change the color just so this stands out and we can tell what we're looking at. So on this graph, right here, we've got this line that connects our, oh, that was way too weird. Let's make it a little bit cuter. There we go. Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost is going to determine the quantity that we want to produce for a profit maximizing firm and the price they're going to charge. And you can kind of play around with this. Made a mistake. Give me one second. There we go. Because it's not perfect, I kind of said, you want to generally figure out where approximately you're looking at. I would say the quantity is obviously between 20 and 30. I would call it 25,000 shirts just for simplicity's sake, but any number in between that's logical works, right? That's the quantity the firm's going to produce. In terms of the price they're going to charge, it's going to be based off this demand curve. I went ahead and just called it $45, but you could call it $48. It does look like it's closer to 50 than 40. Maybe it's $47.50. Maybe it's $48.99. The point is that the price is going to be based off this demand curve, and that means we're going to get that markup above marginal cost. That's the markup we expect in a monopolist or a monopolistically competitive market. The next question asks what quantity this firm would produce if it was perfectly competitive. This is the same way we answer this problem with a monopoly. We're going to compare the monopolistically competitive market to the perfectly competitive market, and it's going to be right about here. And so where marginal cost is equal to demand, that's going to be the, that's still the wrong, I'm trying to find a color that's not in use right here. Let's do that. That's going to be the perfectly competitive outcome, because then price is equal to marginal cost at that point. And so where marginal cost is equal to demand is going to be the quantity. So that's going to be a quantity of 40. And I didn't really ask you what the price is, but you can say, oh, well, it's obviously somewhere between 30 and 40. Maybe it's $32, something like that. So if we were a perfectly competitive market, we would see a higher quantity and a lower price than we see in the monopolistically competitive market, right? Here's the monopolistically competitive market, right? The monopolistic competition quantity of 25 and price of, say, $48 versus the perfectly competitive quantity of 40 and price of maybe $32. The next question asks what the excess capacity is in this market, approximately. And the idea here is that excess capacity is going to be, let's flip this over, the difference between the quantity produced in the monopolistically competitive market and the quantity at which average total cost is minimized. The average total cost is minimized at the quantity where the firm should be producing. That's the efficient quantity for that firm. And so what we see is, if we look at this, and let's go ahead and color it in a really weird color. Let's make it bright pink so it stands out for us. That's our excess capacity. So that's going to be about 20,000 shirts, right? From 25 to 45 is our excess capacity. It's the difference between the quantity the monopolistically competitive firm produces and the quantity that minimizes average total cost. Does that make sense? This average or this excess capacity idea is really important to understanding how and why these markets are inefficient. Even though the inefficiencies are relatively small, they're still meaningful. And so you can see that, as you drag this, if I drag this bracket up, we can see, wow, yeah, this firm would minimize costs at a much higher quantity than it's producing at. That's an inefficiency for the firm and for the market and for society. The last question asks, and this is a little bit tricky, I think, but I think it's a really good question. I like it a lot. Is this firm in the long run or the short run, and how can you tell? And this gets back to how we know this is a monopolistically competitive market, because in the long run, they earn zero economic profit, which means price is going to be equal to average total cost. And we can see that be true right here, right? If I insert another line for where the price is going to be, if I were to try to calculate the profit level here, I would say price minus average total cost times quantity. And price and average total cost are equal. So it's going to be zero no matter what quantity we produce at. And so that's how I know this is a long run outcome, because this firm is earning zero economic profits, and that occurs in the long run. Does that make sense? So in the long run, firms are going to enter and shift this demand curve down until the point where the firm earns zero economic profit. So far, so good? Okay. The next question asks you to consider that Aaron and Viola, two recent Sac State graduates selling winter commencement photo shoot services. They're the first on the campus to do this, and so they get to act like a monopolist. So we want to draw a general graph using a demand, marginal revenue, marginal cost, and average total cost curve. And then in part B, we want to look at what happens when they face competition in the longer run. So let's take this back to the whiteboard, okay? Okay, so we start out with Aaron and Viola getting to act like monopolists. So we're gonna see quantity here, price up here, and then I'm gonna go ahead and graph their marginal cost curve and their average total cost curve. And let's make this stand out because it's gonna be important. And that's one of the takeaways I feel like from these last couple of chapters is that average total cost and marginal cost curves are really important for understanding the mechanisms through which markets behave and change. So I'm going to start with them acting as monopolists, and I'm going to go ahead and use maroon and purple. So I'm going to have a maroon demand curve that looks like this. And that's going to be really elastic demand. And I'll do a pink marginal cost curve that looks like that. And so now they are acting like monopolists. And the big idea, oh God, that was so much worse. The big idea here is that they are earning economic profit in the short run. In the short run, they are earning massive economic profits because they're the only ones doing this. They're the first ones to think about it. So they get that first mover advantage. They're going to produce the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We'll call it Q1. They're going to charge a price based on demand. We're going to call that P1, and that's going to be nice and high. And I'll go ahead and label our demand curve and marginal revenue curve 1 also, because we're going to need to change them as we go forward. That's it. That's the first graph. They're monopolistically competitive and they're earning profits. Their profits are going to be a function of price minus average total cost at the quantity they're producing. So their profits would look like this. Right there. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. Then they're going to face competition. Other students in the art department hear about this idea and decide to offer their services. The services from the art department aren't identical to what Aaron and Viola offer. Everybody kind of has a different setup, different services, different packages, but they do face options. So now the demand that Aaron and Viola face is smaller. If there were 100 students demanding Aaron and Viola's services before, now maybe there's 50, maybe there's 30. So the demand shifts down. And we see the demand shift down to the long run zero profit equilibrium, which is going to be tangent to that average total cost curve. Just like that. Then we're going to see that obviously the marginal revenue curve is going to be down lower too. Something like that. So when we graph this new outcome, we want to find the long run equilibrium. It's going to be again where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So that's going to be a quantity of 2, or the second quantity. And then we're going to go all the way up to the new demand curve to get our new price. But now when we go to calculate profits, we see, wow, average total cost is equal to demand in the long run equilibrium. So there's no longer these profits here. There's now zero profit. And that's what happens. More firms compete, demand shifts down, marginal revenue shifts down, quantities fall, prices fall, and economic profit falls to zero. That's the big dynamic outcome we see in a monopolistically competitive market. So this is like the big idea here. Okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully. If not, let me know. I have another video that's here on Canvas or on YouTube that I'll share with you that compares the outcomes in monopoly, monopolistic competition, and perfectly competitive markets. And I'll share that with you. And hopefully that helps kind of clarify it. Really, a lot of this stuff, it just makes more sense the more you repeat it. So, question number 4 asks about advertising. Think about advertising you've witnessed. What is an example of advertising that conveyed or provided useful information about differences in products? And what's an example of advertising that you heard or considered that might be considered wasteful by economists. And this is just getting back to this idea that we see advertising more in a monopolistically competitive market because there's differentiation in the goods. And the higher the degree of differentiation, the greater the price markup that a monopolistically competitive firm can engage in. So useful advertising might be a product that you didn't know existed, or learning about a quality that you like about a product. My favorite advertising that I find useful is when Instagram tells me about something that I definitely want to buy. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that those things existed. I would definitely like to buy that. So that's a great example, right? Anytime a product is advertised and you say, wow, that information is useful. I didn't know that was on sale, or this had that feature, or this was different from that. That's going to be a really useful thing. I'll give you an example from my life. My partner learned that Taco Bell is bringing back some of its classic menu items. And that was very exciting news for him. He was very excited to learn that some of the things he loved from Taco Bell from the 80s and 90s were now for sale. That is Taco Bell conveying useful, meaningful information to a customer about a product. Wasteful advertising is advertising that tries to create differences where there isn't any, or advertising that raises costs without altering demand. So I can think about advertising for goods that aren't very different. I sometimes think about advertising for gasoline companies, right? Maybe the difference between Shell and Chevron and Arco is meaningful for some people, but to me, I think that's kind of wasteful. I don't think the gasoline is very different, and I always just pursue the lowest price. So to me, that would be more wasteful advertising. And that's what you kind of want to think about is this advertising conveying information that's going to help consumers make a better choice, or is it just creating an illusion of difference, an illusion of differentiation of goods? And this is personal, so really, as long as it makes sense to you, you're probably going to get the credit for that question. The last question is a little bit interesting, but I really like it. Craig's Auto Repair Shop is a small independent shop in a small rural town, and they mark up the cost of repairs by 200%, so basically tripling the cost. Grace's Auto Shop is a small independent shop run in a large city where there's maybe more competition, and repairs are marked up by 100% on average. Why might we see higher markups in the smaller town? And the big idea here gets back to this idea of how competition affects markets. We don't see this erosion of demand, this decreasing of demand and of the marginal revenue curve without competition. And in a small town, there's necessarily going to be less competition. There's maybe one, maybe two or three auto shops in a small town. Whereas in a big city, you have lots of options. You can go lots of different places. And that increased competition is going to mean less markup for the firms. In a small town with less competition, you can mark up more because your customers have fewer options and the demand is divided by a smaller number. Does that kind of make sense? The big idea here is just that competition erodes those markups, and the more competition there is, the smaller the markup we are going to see. We can think about talking about oligopoly and monopoly and how trade tends to reduce markup and monopoly and market power because it increases competition a lot. Does that kind of make sense? I hope so. I feel like we went through this pretty quickly. Let me know what questions you have. Let me know what you'd like to go over more, what questions you have about this stuff, and I'll see you next time. Otherwise, have a great day.